please, for the love of all that is good, do not do this. This system uptime is absolutely terrifying, and if you do this, you are a bad Linux user who needs to have their Linux card taken away. And if you're a system administrator and you do this, I really hope that I'm not one of your users, because that is a terrifying system to be connecting to. Coming into the Linux world as recently as I did in like 2019 or so, I want to say, there is a lot of things that I still don't understand. But I want to spend my time actually researching them and seeing if there's some merit to it actually being done. One of those things is caring about your system uptime. What I do know, though, is that there is a lot of bad advice that floats around the Linux desktop space, so I dug deep into the weeds to find out why people do care. Because it's one thing to have a system that's been online for a couple of days, but I've seen people with a couple of weeks, months, years, and I saw one person, I'm not even joking, had an uptime on a server they were running for a business of 15 years. Now, it's one thing to have a legacy embedded system that has literally never touched the internet and is no longer being updated. Let's say it's like controlling an arm in a factory. It does its job, and that's all it needs to do. But even then, rebooting a system like that is incredibly important to make sure you know it can reboot. What I mean by this is, in that 15-year case, multiple different people took over that job, and the reason why they just never rebooted it is because they didn't know they could. They knew they could turn it off, that part was fine, but they didn't know if it would turn back on because it hadn't been turned off in 15 years, and even if they did turn it back on, they didn't know they could actually get it back into the same state where everything was going to be working like they had it working. But what about something that's not a legacy system that is being updated and does actually go online? Well, if we're talking about a Linux system, there are ways you can sort of push out the uptime further, but that does have its limits. So things like the kernel cannot be updated without actually reloading the kernel. But what you can do is you can do live kernel patching to basically make some changes to it. From my understanding, though, live kernel patching can't address every single thing with the kernel, but it does at least give you some way to push it out further if you need the system to be online for a little bit longer. Also, if you go and update various programs in your system and system processes, all of these need to be restarted to make sure you actually have updated them and you're not just running the old version. Now, just because you can do this does not mean you should. If we're talking about a production system and for whatever reason it can't go offline until tomorrow or next week because you're going to have its backup actually set up then, you can justify spending a couple of hours actually getting all of that stuff done. But what about a personal system? What about a desktop system where just rebooting the system doesn't really cause that much of a problem? Or maybe it's your Plex server. Sure, you might be using your Plex server most of the day, but I'm sure you're not watching movies as you're actually sleeping. In which case, that seems like a pretty good time to actually do a reboot. But what if it's your backup server and you're doing backups literally every single night? Well, when the backup is done, have the system turn off. I've heard all of these reasons for why their system can't be turned off or their server can't be turned off, but there's always going to be some period of time where that system is not being used. I guess unless you're a crypto miner, but if you're a crypto miner, that's a whole different class of people. The more I read from actual system admins, the more this seems to be a holdover from the 90s where individual server uptime actually did matter, and that somehow made its way into the desktop space. From my understanding, back then, early Windows servers had a reputation for being really, really unstable, so you were better off sticking with a Unix-based system because that system is just never going to go down. And this thought process made so much sense back in the 90s and earlier, because back then, we didn't have these mass-distributed servers. If you wanted your service to go to more users, what you would do is you would buy a bigger server or buy a bigger mainframe. This is called vertical scaling. The problem with vertical scaling, though, is it gets very expensive very quickly. So let's say you look at the Intel Xeon line. You go from one Xeon up to the next Xeon, and maybe there's like a 5% difference, but the Xeon above costs like $5,000 more. And then maybe the Xeon above that is only 3% better, and that costs another $7,000. And that might make sense for certain workloads, but for general servery stuff, we don't do that anymore because it's really stupid and there are cheaper ways to do it. One of the companies who came up with that was Google. How about instead of having this really big server, we have a bunch of terrible servers, but we have a lot of them? This is considerably cheaper and also has the advantage of not being as susceptible to downtime. That right there is the big thing that changed in the early 2000s. Rather than having one big system, and if that big system goes down, everything dies, now we have a bunch of little systems, and maybe if one of them goes out, you lose servers for a couple of users, but then another little system can just pick up that load, and those other users can be distributed amongst the other servers. It's not really as big of a deal. This new way of managing services is known as horizontal scaling because you're buying more things rather than buying one bigger thing. So with this change of server management comes a change in the value of individual servers. A lot of big companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, companies like that, once a day, once a week, whatever time period they use, have a script that just randomly shuts down one of their servers to actually test their redundancy to make sure if they do have a big outage, the service actually stays online. Even in a horizontally scaled system, that doesn't mean the service is never going to go offline. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all of these companies have had outages. There's not really much you can do if your entire data center loses power, or if like Cloudflare blacklists you or something like that, but it does mean that the system is far, far more redundant. And I don't work for these companies, but I can tell you with almost absolute certainty, there is not a single server in their server clusters that has a year of uptime. The cluster itself almost certainly does, but each individual server has without a doubt been rebooted multiple times in the past year, at least if they have reasonable system admins that know what they're actually doing. And while this isn't the case for every sysadmin, it does seem to be the majority of people who say if they see an individual server that has a high server uptime, that's sort of an indication that the person who's working on it before them was not good at their job. It indicates that server is full of vulnerabilities that just have not been patched, and they don't trust that the system can actually be restarted, whether that's because of their poor configuration or because the software it's running is an absolute spaghetti code and they have no idea how it works. The modern gold standard is a high service uptime, not a high server uptime. Users of your service shouldn't have any idea that individual servers have actually gone down. Everything that they are doing should work exactly the same way. But what does all of this have to do with desktop systems? The point I'm making here is a lot of people in the desktop Linux space have no idea why anyone cared about uptime, have no idea it had to do with servers and not the desktop space, and now basically just like compare these uptimes as if this is a thing that you should actually be proud of. Update your system, do a reboot to make sure those updates actually get applied, and when you're not using your system at night, just go and turn it off and save a bit of power. The only reason to care about system uptime is because other people care about system uptime. All it does is shows me that your system is probably unpatched and is a security nightmare. So that's going to be it for me. If you have a reason why you care about uptime, I would love to hear it, especially if it's actually a good reason, because I genuinely have never heard one. And if you like this video, remember to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe to Only Bearer Pay, link in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, and that's going to be it for me, so I'm out.